Amanda, Coleman said quietly as he turned away from Mr. Washington, call social services if he won't leave. It was the standard response. Position yourself as concerned rather than dismissive, even while showing the problem to the door. Mr. Washington's voice stopped him. Your bank's charter was approved in 1978, the old man said, his tone steady and factual. But before that, Piedmont Savings and Loan owned this building from 1965 to 1977. And before that, it was the site of Washington General Store and 6 family homes, all owned by the descendants of Benjamin Washington, a freedman who purchased this land in 1892. Coleman turned slowly, surprised by the specificity. Customer demographics suggested that a man of Mr. Washington's age and apparent socioeconomic status was unlikely to have detailed knowledge of banking history or property records. It disrupted the narrative Coleman had constructed: the confused old man, the wasted time, the quick dismissal. That's very specific information. Coleman managed, his professional smile faltering slightly. Should be specific. It's my family history. Mr. Washington's eyes held a clarity that made Coleman uncomfortable. My grandfather, William, expanded the store in 1925. My father helped run it until 1964, when the city declared this area blighted and seized it through eminent domain. Paid us pennies on the dollar, then sold it to developers for 10 times that amount. The security guard had moved even closer now, hands still resting near his holster. Coleman noticed several customers openly watching the exchange, including a woman in a tailored suit who appeared to be listening with particular interest. Mr. Washington, Coleman said, lowering his voice and adopting his most reasonable tone. Property disputes from the 1960s are well beyond this branch's authority to address. If you believe you have a legitimate legal claim, you should consult an attorney. Been to 17 attorneys over the years, Mr. Washington replied, unperturbed. Most wouldn't even look at the documents. The few who did said the same thing. Statute of limitations, burden of proof, cost of litigation. He shook his head slowly. But this isn't just about legal claims. It's about acknowledging the truth. Coleman felt sweat forming at his temples. The bank's regional vice president was scheduled to visit next week, and any hint of controversy, particularly one involving racial history, could jeopardize his pending promotion. I understand your concerns, Coleman said, though he didn't. But I'm afraid there's simply nothing I can do about historical grievances, however genuine they might be. He glanced at his watch again, more pointedly this time. Now, if you'll excuse me. By late afternoon, the bank's conference room had transformed into an impromptu historical investigation. Mr. Washington sat at the head of the table, his documents spread before him, surrounded by Ms. Bennett from the Historical Society, 2 attorneys who had been customers in the bank, Coleman, and 3 members of the bank's regional management team who had been hastily summoned. The evidence was compelling. William Washington had indeed owned significant property that now included the bank's location and surrounding commercial developments. The land had been seized through a combination of predatory lending practices, manipulated tax assessments, and ultimately eminent domain claims that had paid the Washington family pennies on the dollar during the urban renewal projects of the 1960s. My father tried to fight it, Mr. Washington explained, revealing newspaper clippings showing protests and legal challenges. But back then, who listened to a black man claiming the system was cheating him? He died believing no one would ever care about the truth. One of the attorneys, who recognized the significance of the case, made several phone calls. By evening, a reporter from the city newspaper had arrived, and a local historian confirmed that Mr. Washington's case was just one example of systematic dispossession that had occurred throughout the city during that era. Coleman, now ashen-faced, conferred quietly with the regional directors. The bank's parent company had acquired the property in the 1980s, but the chain of title now revealed serious ethical and potentially legal issues that couldn't be ignored. We need to make this right, said the oldest of the regional directors, a woman who had risen through the ranks over 30 years. Not just for appearances, but because it is right. The conference room buzzed with tension and possibility. Sunlight slanted through vertical blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished table, where Mr. Washington's life's work now lay exposed. The room smelled of coffee and photocopier toner. Someone had begun making duplicates of the key documents, the whirring machine creating a rhythmic backdrop to the murmured conversations. Patricia Winters, the senior regional director, studied a property assessment from 1964 with narrowed eyes. At 62, she had seen the banking industry transform through multiple crises and evolutions. She had started as a teller in 1982, when women in banking leadership was still a rarity, and had fought her way up through determination and an unwavering moral compass that sometimes put her at odds with her colleagues. This assessment claims the Washington property was structurally unsound, she said, tapping the document with a manicured fingernail. But these photographs from the same month show a well-maintained building. The discrepancy is obvious. James Harrington, the retired attorney who had been in line at the bank, nodded. Classic tactic during that era: declare a property substandard, lower its paper value, then use that valuation to determine compensation during eminent domain proceedings. Catherine Bennett carefully arranged a series of photographs in chronological order, creating a visual timeline. The Washington General Store served as more than just a business, she explained. Based on these community newsletters, it was a gathering place, an impromptu community center. There's even evidence it served as an unofficial bank for local residents who weren't welcomed at traditional financial institutions. Mr. Washington nodded, the memories flooding back. White banks wouldn't lend to colored folks back then. Excuse me, that's what they called us in those days. My grandfather kept a safe in the back room. Held money for people, helped them save for homes, for education. No interest charged, no fees. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The contrast between the community-centered approach of the Washington store and the profit-driven metrics by which his own performance was measured felt like an indictment. The youngest of the regional directors, a man named Thomas Chen, had been quiet throughout most of the discussion, taking notes and occasionally checking his phone. Now he looked up, his expression grave. I've been texting with our legal department, he said. They've confirmed that our title insurance wouldn't cover issues like this, ethical lapses in how the property was acquired before our purchase. If this story goes public, which it clearly will, we have significant exposure, both legally and in terms of public relations. Patricia Winters nodded, unsurprised. So we have both a moral obligation and a business incentive to address this properly. The reporter, who had been taking photographs and recording the conversation with permission, leaned forward. Would you say the bank is acknowledging the historical injustice that occurred here? Patricia Winters stood at the podium, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. Today marks not an end, but a beginning, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. For too long, our financial institutions have been reluctant to acknowledge the role banking played in perpetuating racial inequities. This plaque and the Washington Family Foundation represent our commitment to not only recognizing that history, but working actively to repair its damage. Mr. Washington sat in a place of honor, a folding chair adorned with a small bouquet. His children had flown in for the occasion, Michael from Atlanta, where he worked as an engineer, Eliza from Chicago, where she taught history, and James from San Francisco, where he ran a community development nonprofit. His grandchildren, 7 in all, ranging from 8 to 22, surrounded him like a protective guard of honor. Catherine Bennett from the Historical Society approached with a leather-bound volume. Mr. Washington, this is the first copy of our new publication, Reclaiming History, The Washington Family Legacy. Your family's story will be taught in schools throughout the state. Mr. Washington accepted the book with trembling hands. Inside were reproductions of his documents, alongside historical analysis, maps, and newly conducted interviews with community elders who remembered the Washington General Store. The foreword had been written by a prominent civil rights attorney who praised the Washington family's persistence as a testament to the power of memory as a tool for justice. Coleman, standing slightly apart from the main group, watched the proceedings with complicated emotions. The past months had changed him profoundly. The training program he had initiated had led him to uncomfortable realizations about his own unconscious biases and the structural inequities he had tacitly supported throughout his career. Yet there was also a sense of purpose in his work now that had been absent before, a connection to something larger than quarterly profits and performance metrics. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Coleman approached Mr. Washington. "Sir," he said, extending his hand, "I want to thank you." Mr. Washington looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For teaching me what a bank should be," Coleman replied. "Your grandfather's safe in the back room of his store did more for this community than our institution managed in 40 years. Mr. Joseph Washington, a 78-year-old former jazz musician with weathered hands and slow, deliberate movements, entered First National Bank on a busy Friday afternoon. His shabby coat hung loosely on his thin frame, and he clutched a worn leather satchel close to his chest. The security guard exchanged knowing glances with the teller as Mr. Washington shuffled toward the counter, leaving slight scuff marks on the polished marble floor. The bank was crowded with the usual end-of-week customers, young professionals in tailored suits, middle-aged couples discussing mortgage options, and bank employees hurrying between desks. Conversations hushed momentarily as Mr. Washington approached the counter, his presence seemingly out of place in the sleek, modern institution. "I need to see the manager," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who had lived through decades of history. The teller, Amanda, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a practiced smile, barely concealed her impatience. "Sir, I can help you with most banking matters. What seems to be the issue?" she asked, her eyes darting to the growing line behind him. Mr. Washington placed his worn leather bag on the counter with surprising firmness. "This isn't about cashing a check. I need to speak with whoever's in charge." Behind Amanda, two loan officers whispered and chuckled, one mimicking Mr. Washington's stooped posture when they thought he wasn't looking. The security guard shifted his weight, moving slightly closer to the counter, hand resting casually near his holster. "Please," Mr. Washington added, his eyes reflecting a dignity that contradicted his appearance. "It's important." The morning had started like any other for Mr. Washington. He had risen with the sun, a habit formed during 6 decades of working life that retirement couldn't break. After a simple breakfast in his small apartment, decorated with faded photographs of his late wife Eliza and their 3 children who had long since moved away to different states, he had pulled the battered leather satchel from beneath his bed. The bag itself was a legacy, passed down from his father, who had received it from his father before him. The leather was cracked in places, patched carefully with pieces from an old belt, the brass clasps tarnished but functional. Inside lay the culmination of generations of hope, persistence, and pain, carefully preserved documents that told a story few wanted to hear. "Today's the day, Eliza," he had whispered to his wife's photograph, "been putting it off too long already." The bus ride downtown had taken 40 minutes. Mr. Washington had sat silently, watching the neighborhood change around him, from the modest homes and small businesses of his community to the gleaming high-rises and chain stores of the financial district. He'd watched this transformation happen slowly over decades, each new development erasing another piece of the world he had known. Now, standing in the bank, he felt the weight of those changes. The marble floor beneath his worn shoes had once been soil where his grandfather had grown vegetables. The space now occupied by the loan officers' desks had once housed his grandmother's kitchen, where she had taught neighborhood children to read when the segregated schools proved inadequate. Amanda cleared her throat, drawing him back to the present. "Sir, if you could just tell me what this is concerning." Mr. Washington studied her face. She was young, probably no older than his youngest granddaughter, not unkind, but impatient, a product of a world that moved too fast to notice the foundations it was built upon. "It concerns history, young lady," he replied, his voice gaining strength, "and justice that's long overdue." A well-dressed man in line behind him sighed audibly. "Some of us have actual business to conduct," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. Mr. Washington didn't turn around. He had expected this, the dismissal, the impatience, the subtle and not so subtle indications that he didn't belong. He had faced worse in his life. Much worse. "I'll wait all day if I have to," he said to Amanda, settling his weight more firmly on the polished floor that had once belonged to his family. "Some things are worth waiting for." The security guard approached, his face a practiced mask of professional concern. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing the question to Amanda rather than Mr. Washington. "No problem," Mr. Washington answered before she could speak. "Just a man conducting business." He patted the leather satchel again. "Important business." The guard and Amanda exchanged glances, a silent conversation that Mr. Washington recognized all too well. He had seen such looks throughout his life, from the schoolyard to job interviews to bank loan applications. It was the look of people trying to decide whether he was a nuisance, a joke, or a threat. 3 months later, Mr. Washington stood on the sidewalk outside First National Bank, watching as workers installed a bronze plaque beside the entrance. A crowd had gathered for the official unveiling: community members, local officials, and news cameras. The plaque commemorated William Washington and other black property owners whose land had been unjustly taken, acknowledging the historical injustice that had shaped the development of the city. But it was more than symbolic. After weeks of negotiations, the bank had established the Washington Family Foundation with a $5 million endowment to support education, housing assistance, and small business development in historically marginalized neighborhoods. Mr. Washington had become something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools and community events about perseverance and the importance of preserving family history. The documents he had carefully collected and protected were now being digitized by the Historical Society for an exhibit on urban development and racial justice. Coleman, who had initially dismissed Mr. Washington, had undergone his own transformation. Working closely with the foundation, he had initiated a bank-wide training program on the history of discriminatory banking practices and developed new lending policies specifically designed to address historical inequities. As the ceremonial ribbon was cut and applause filled the air, Mr. Washington felt his eyes grow moist. He thought of his grandfather and father, who had never lived to see this day. "They thought we'd be forgotten," he whispered to himself, clutching the same old leather bag that had carried the truth all those years. But some stories refused to stay buried. A young boy approached him, notebook in hand, for a school project. "Mr. Washington," he asked, "how did you never give up when everyone laughed at you?" Mr. Washington smiled, the wisdom of his years shining in his eyes. "Truth doesn't care if people believe in it or not. It just waits to be discovered." Behind him, the bank continued its business, but it was forever changed, as was the community around it, by the quiet persistence of an old man with a bag full of history who refused to be silenced. The morning had dawned clear and bright, reminiscent of the day decades ago when Mr. Washington had watched bulldozers tear down his family's store. Today, however, the mood was one of reconciliation rather than destruction. The crowd that gathered outside the bank represented a cross-section of the community: elderly residents who remembered the old neighborhood, middle-aged professionals, young activists, and children from local schools who had been studying the Washington family's story as part of a new curriculum on local history. As Coleman retreated to his office, Mr. Washington reached into his bag and extracted a thick folder bound with faded ribbon. With trembling fingers, he spread several yellow documents across the counter, including land deeds, newspaper clippings from the 1940s, and black and white photographs. "My grandfather, William Washington, owned 10 acres right here. This very spot," he explained to Amanda, who had reluctantly remained at the counter. "After he served in World War II, came back a hero, but they still took it all." A well-dressed woman in line behind Mr. Washington stepped forward, adjusting her glasses to peer at the documents. "Excuse me," she said, "but I'm Catherine Bennett from the Historical Society. May I see those papers?" The atmosphere in the bank shifted subtly as Ms. Bennett examined the documents with professional interest. "These appear to be authentic," she remarked. "This is a property deed dated 1920, and these." She traced her finger over a series of official-looking letters, These show correspondence about eminent domain seizures that weren't properly compensated. More customers gathered around, drawn by the unfolding drama. Among them was a gray-haired man who introduced himself as a retired attorney specializing in property law. These documents suggest a legitimate claim, he commented, scanning through the papers. Coleman emerged from his office, alarmed by the growing crowd around Mr. Washington's counter. The security guard now stood back, uncertain, as the bank's customers, professionals, academics, and community members engaged with Mr. Washington's story with increasing interest and concern. "There's more," Mr. Washington said, his voice steadier now. "Much more." Catherine Bennett had not planned to visit the bank that day. She had simply been on her way to lunch when she realized she needed cash for the weekend. The Historical Society, where she worked as a senior archivist, was just 3 blocks away, housed in a Victorian building that had once been the city's main library. For 15 years, she had dedicated herself to preserving the area's history, painstakingly cataloging documents, photographs, and oral histories that told the story of their community, both the celebrated narratives and the darker chapters that many prefer to forget. When she heard Mr. Washington mention his grandfather's name, something clicked in her memory. The society had recently received a donation of city planning documents from the 1960s, and she had been working through them slowly, digitizing each page. She remembered seeing the name Washington on several maps marking properties targeted for urban renewal. "Mr. Washington," she said, carefully lifting a faded photograph from the counter, "is this your grandfather's store?" The photograph showed a 2-story brick building with a hand-painted sign reading Washington General Store. In front stood a tall, dignified black man in a vest and tie, flanked by a woman and 3 children. "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Washington replied, his voice softening with memory. "That's him. William Washington, finest man I ever knew. Built that store with his own hands, brick by brick. That's my grandmother Esther beside him, and my father is the youngest boy there." Branch manager Richard Coleman emerged from his office reluctantly, summoned by Amanda's discreet phone call. His day had already been filled with meetings and reports, and the last thing he needed was to deal with what his staff described as a confused old man causing a scene. "How can I help you today, sir?" Coleman asked, maintaining a professional tone while glancing repeatedly at his watch. Mr. Washington straightened his posture as much as his aging spine would allow. "My name is Joseph Washington. I have business to discuss regarding this property." He patted the leather bag. Coleman's smile tightened. "Mr. Washington, if you're having trouble with your account or need assistance with a transaction, one of our tellers would be happy to help you." "You're not listening," Mr. Washington insisted, his voice gaining strength. "This bank stands on land that once belonged to my family." A few customers turned to watch the exchange. One of the loan officers rolled his eyes dramatically, making a drinking motion with his hand to his colleague. The security guard moved closer. "Sir," Coleman said, his patience wearing thin, "we've been at this location for over 40 years. I'm afraid you must be confused. Now, if there's nothing else." Mr. Washington unclasped his bag with steady hands. "I have the documents right here, all the proof. My grandfather's land was taken, and I've spent 20 years collecting the evidence." Coleman sighed heavily. "Mr. Washington, I'm very busy today. Perhaps you could make an appointment for next week." He was already turning away, signaling to Amanda to handle the situation. "They always say that," Mr. Washington muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Been saying that to my family for 3 generations now." Richard Coleman had worked at First National for 15 years, climbing the corporate ladder with careful precision. At 45, he had achieved the comfortable mid-level management position he had always aspired to: stable, respectable, with good benefits, and just enough authority to satisfy his ego without the crushing responsibility of executive leadership. His office walls were decorated with plaques celebrating quarterly performance goals, customer satisfaction ratings, and community service initiatives that had been carefully calculated to generate maximum positive publicity with minimal institutional commitment. He had seen people like Mr. Washington before, elderly individuals confused about financial matters, sometimes with grievances real or imagined, often consuming valuable time with rambling stories that led nowhere. The training manual didn't have a specific protocol for such situations, but the unwritten rule was clear. Be polite, be brief, and redirect. Catherine nodded, her professional demeanor momentarily broken by genuine emotion. We have city planning maps from 1964 that show this entire block marked for demolition. They labeled it as blighted property, despite evidence to the contrary. The retired attorney, who had introduced himself as James Harrington, examined a legal document with experienced eyes. The compensation offered was well below market value, he noted, and these protest letters from your father was systematically ignored. This fits a pattern we now recognize in many cities during that era. Amanda, who had been watching with increasing interest, leaned forward to see the photographs. That store was right here, where we're standing. The store was here, Mr. Washington confirmed, pointing to the ground beneath their feet. Our house was where those offices are now. He gestured toward the loan department. My mother's garden took up what's now the parking lot. She grew the sweetest tomatoes you ever tasted. The small crowd had grown larger. A young black woman who worked as a loan processor had abandoned her desk to listen. An elderly couple who had been discussing retirement accounts stood transfixed by the unfolding story. Even the security guard had moved closer, his professional caution replaced by genuine curiosity. Coleman watched from the doorway of his office, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation. The narrative was shifting before his eyes. What had begun as an inconvenience, a disruption to be managed, was transforming into something else entirely. History, supposedly safely buried beneath marble floors and corporate logos, was pushing its way back into the present. Mr. Washington, Catherine said, her voice carrying an archivist's controlled excitement. These documents could be incredibly important for our city's historical record. They fill gaps in our understanding of how this neighborhood changed during urban renewal.